A heart full of ghosts. The winter morning pressed heavily against the city, a blanket of frost clinging stubbornly to rooftops and windowpanes. Inside a small apartment on the east side of town, Benjamin Hayes sat on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped together, staring at the untouched pillow beside him. A year and a half had passed since Lily had left him, yet her presence still lingered in the smallest details, the faint scent of lavender on her pillow, the way her favorite mug still sat in the kitchen cabinet, untouched, as if waiting for her return. Ben exhaled, rubbing his tired eyes. The weight of loneliness was something he had grown used to, yet today, it felt heavier than usual. His job as a police officer kept him busy, but even the badge couldn't shield him from the emptiness that followed him home every night. The alarm clock let out a shrill beep, breaking the heavy silence. Without looking, he reached over and silenced it with a practiced motion. 6:30 a.m. Another Sunday. The morning routine was muscle memory at this point. He threw on a gray sweatshirt and jeans, made his way to the kitchen, and started the coffee maker. The rich scent filled the air, mingling with the cold stillness of the apartment. He stared blankly at the dark liquid dripping into the pot. This isn't living. This is existing. He had always thought grief came in waves, crashing hard, then retreating, giving you moments to breathe. But his grief wasn't like that. It was the ocean itself, vast and endless, stretching beyond the horizon, swallowing everything. Lily had wanted kids. He hadn't been ready. They had planned for someday, but someday never came. And now, the silence of the apartment mocked him. Slinging his jacket over his shoulders, he grabbed his car keys and stepped outside. The streets were beginning to wake. A few early risers walked their dogs, a jogger passed by, breath rising in the cold air. Ben wasn't even sure where he was driving at first. The police station was in the opposite direction, but his hands moved on autopilot, steering him through familiar roads, past parks and buildings he had seen 1,000 times. Then he saw it. A small, aging brick building with an iron gate. The East Haven orphanage. He had passed it dozens of times, maybe more. It wasn't anything special, just another forgotten place tucked into the city. A place for children no one wanted. But today, something made him stop. He pulled over. Why? He didn't know. The engine hummed softly as he sat there, staring at the old building. A faded sign swung gently in the wind. He could see the silhouettes of children moving inside through the frosted windows. Before he could talk himself out of it, he pushed the car door open and stepped out. The iron gate groaned as he pushed it forward, the cold metal biting against his fingertips. The door opened before he could knock. A woman, likely in her mid-50s, with graying auburn hair and kind, perceptive eyes, met his gaze. Officer Hayes, she read his badge instinctively, then glanced up at him, curiosity flickering in her expression. "Can I help you?" Ben hesitated. What was he even looking for? "I just wanted to look around," he said, realizing how absurd it sounded. Her lips pressed together in thought before she stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. "Come in. I'm Margaret, the director here." The warmth of the orphanage was a stark contrast to the cold outside. Inside, the scent of baked bread and fresh laundry filled the air. A few children ran past them, their laughter echoing through the halls. Margaret led him toward a playroom. "Are you interested in adoption?" she asked carefully. Ben opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer. Before he could respond, he heard it. A whisper. Soft. Fragile. No one ever picks them. Something in that voice made his stomach clench. He turned toward the source. There, in the farthest corner of the playroom, sat two small figures. They were huddled together, their tiny hands gripping onto each other as if the world itself would take them apart. White-haired, impossibly thin, with hauntingly large eyes that carried a weight far beyond their years. They weren't playing. They weren't even watching the other children. They just sat there, waiting. Ben felt something stir in his chest, something deep and unshakable. Who are they? His voice was quieter than he intended. Margaret followed his gaze and sighed. Elias and Noah. They're twins. 6 years old. They've been here since they were infants. Infants? Ben's brows furrowed. They've been in the system that long? Margaret nodded, a sad smile tugging at the corners of her lips. They've been in and out of foster homes more times than I can count. Every time they get placed, they're sent back. Some say they're too quiet. Others say they're odd. Ben studied them. They were quiet. Too still for children their age. It wasn't normal. What happened to their parents? Margaret's expression darkened. Their mother left them at the hospital the day they were born. No name. No explanation. Just, gone. No one's ever claimed them. Ben swallowed. He knew what that kind of abandonment did to kids. He had seen it before. Then, as if sensing his gaze, one of the twins, Noah, the smaller one, lifted his head. Their eyes met. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. Do we have to be good so you don't give us back? Ben's heart clenched so hard he could barely breathe. The words hit like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. In that moment, the past and present blurred. He wasn't in the orphanage anymore. He was in a hospital room, holding Lily's hand as she whispered her last words to him. You have so much love to give, Ben. Don't waste it. He had wasted it. He had spent the last year running from it. But now, as he looked into Noah's eyes, he knew. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. And he could no longer walk away. A choice he wasn't ready to make. Ben sat in the orphanage's small, dimly lit office, staring at his hands. His fingers were laced together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Across from him, Margaret studied him with quiet curiosity. He still didn't know why he was here. Or maybe he did. Noah's words had burrowed into his chest like a splinter, small yet unbearably painful. Do we have to be good so you don't give us back? The question kept replaying in his mind. He had seen things in his years as a cop that had left him numb. Crime scenes, broken families, children caught in the worst kinds of circumstances. But nothing had prepared him for the way those words had shattered him. Margaret's voice pulled him back. You look like a man standing at the edge of something. Ben exhaled sharply. I don't know what I'm doing here. You wouldn't be the first, she said, smiling softly. Ben rubbed his face, exhaustion weighing him down. They've been in the system their whole lives? Yes. And no one. Margaret shook her head. Not for long, anyway. They've been placed multiple times, but it never lasts. Some foster families said they were too quiet. Others complained that they didn't behave like normal kids. Some were outright cruel. Ben's stomach twisted. Cruel how? Margaret hesitated before answering. One family locked them in a basement because they said they'd creeped them out. Another sent them back after only a week because they weren't affectionate enough. Ben clenched his jaw. He had seen monsters wearing the masks of normal people before, but hearing about this kind of neglect made his blood boil. They're just kids, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Yes, Margaret agreed. But not many people see them that way. They've always been different. No one ever asks about them. She tilted her head slightly, watching him. Until today. Ben looked away. He didn't have an answer for that. Margaret leaned forward. What is it about them? He hesitated, shaking his head. I don't know. But that wasn't entirely true. It was the way they had held onto each other in the shadows, clinging to one another like they were the only safe thing in the world. The way their eyes carried a silent knowledge no child should ever have. And Noah's voice, so small, so desperate. He had lost people before. He had buried pain, shoved it down, ignored it. But this was different. They don't trust easily, Margaret continued. They've learned not to. Ben let out a slow breath. Why are they still here? Margaret sighed, folding her hands on the desk. Because no one wants them. The words landed heavily between them. Ben thought of all the people he had arrested over the years, men who had destroyed their families, women who had walked away from their children, parents who had treated their kids like nothing more than an inconvenience. And yet here were these two boys, unwanted and abandoned before they even had a chance. Margaret watched him carefully. Would you like to meet them? Ben hesitated. I already did. I mean really meet them. Something inside him screamed no. That this was a mistake. That he wasn't the kind of man who could be a father. But another part of him, the part he had been ignoring for too long, whispered something else. You already made your choice the moment you walked through that door. Yeah, he said finally. I'd like that. The twins. The playroom was quieter now. Most of the children had wandered off to other activities, leaving only Elias and Noah in their shadowy corner. They didn't look up when Ben approached. They remained curled together, their hands locked between them. He crouched down, keeping some distance, not wanting to startle them. Hey. No reaction. Ben wasn't great with kids. He didn't have the soft, gentle way of speaking like teachers or foster parents did. He was blunt, straightforward. But something told him these boys wouldn't respond to sugarcoating anyway. I heard you guys have been here for a long time. Noah glanced at him but didn't say anything. Elias remained still. Ben rubbed the back of his neck. Must be tough. Silence. Then, finally, Noah spoke. They always leave. Ben swallowed. Yeah. I heard about that. Noah tightened his grip on Elias's hand. Because we're not good enough. The words were spoken so matter-of-factly that it sent a wave of nausea through Ben. That's not true, he said before he could stop himself. Noah met his gaze, something unreadable in his expression. Then why does everyone leave? Ben exhaled. He wasn't good at this. He didn't know the right things to say. But he knew one thing. These boys had been hurt more times than they could count. And they were still waiting for it to happen again. Elias, who had been silent this entire time, finally shifted. His voice was barely a whisper. Are you going to take us away? Ben felt something inside him crack. He didn't know how to answer that. He wasn't here to adopt. That wasn't the plan. He hadn't even thought about it until now. But looking at them, seeing the way they held onto each other as if bracing for the next abandonment, he realized something. They had already prepared themselves for him to leave. And for the first time in a long, long time, Ben Hayes didn't want to walk away. I don't know, he admitted. Noah looked down, as if he had expected that answer. Elias's grip on his brother's hand tightened. Ben wasn't good at making promises. He had seen too many of them broken. But for the first time in years, he wanted to try. You guys like pancakes? He asked suddenly. Noah blinked. Elias tilted his head. Ben shrugged. I make some pretty damn good pancakes. Elias hesitated, then nodded. Noah studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. Why are you asking? Ben smiled. Because if you're gonna trust me, I figure we should start with breakfast. Noah stared at him for a long moment before whispering, okay. Elias gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Ben's heart ached. It wasn't much. But it was a start. And for the first time since Lily had left, he didn't feel completely alone. The weight of their silence. The car ride was quiet. Not the kind of easy, comfortable silence Ben had once known, like the kind he used to share with Sarah on long drives, where words weren't necessary because everything was understood. No, this was different. This was the kind of silence that came from people who had learned that speaking too much could get them hurt. Elias and Noah sat stiffly in the back seat, their small bodies pressed close together, their hands still locked like a lifeline. They barely moved, their gazes flickering between each other and the world outside the window, as if expecting this moment to end any second now. Ben could feel the tension radiating off them. It sat heavy in the air, making his chest ache. He wasn't sure what to say. He had never done anything like this before. He was a cop. He knew how to talk to criminals, how to get a confession, how to read a suspect's body language. But none of that mattered here. These weren't criminals. They were just kids. Kids who had been hurt one too many times. Ben tightened his grip on the steering wheel, swallowing the lump in his throat. What the hell are you doing, Ben? This wasn't his life. He wasn't the guy who did things like this. But one look in the rearview mirror, one glance at those two fragile, white-haired boys huddled together in the back seat, told him he wasn't turning back now. Not yet. He cleared his throat. So, what do you guys like on your pancakes? The question hung in the air for a moment, as if neither of them knew how to respond. Then, softly, Noah said, "We don't know." Ben frowned. "You don't know?" Elias shook his head, barely moving. "We never had pancakes before." The words hit Ben like a sucker punch. Never had pancakes? A knot twisted in his stomach. Pancakes weren't some extravagant luxury. They were a childhood staple. Something every kid should have had at least once. But these boys. They had never been given even that. Ben forced his voice to stay light. "Well, I guess we're gonna have to fix that." Noah glanced at Elias before hesitantly nodding. It wasn't much. But it was something. The diner. The small diner on the corner of 5th and Main was the kind of place where the coffee was always hot, the waitresses called you Han, and the pancakes were thick and buttery. It was one of the few places Ben still found comfort in after Sarah. As they stepped inside, the smell of sizzling bacon and maple syrup filled the air. The place wasn't too crowded, just a few regulars scattered around, sipping their coffee and reading newspapers. Ben led the boys to a booth by the window, sliding into the seat across from them. Elias and Noah sat carefully, their movements hesitant, like they weren't sure if they belonged here. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Martha, approached with a smile. "Hey there, Ben," she greeted. "It's been a while." Ben nodded. "Yeah, been busy." Martha's gaze flickered to the boys, curiosity in her eyes. "And who do we have here?" Noah looked down at the table. Elias pressed himself slightly against his brother. Ben cleared his throat. "This is Elias and Noah." There, he hesitated. What were they to him? He wasn't their guardian. Not yet. Friends. Martha didn't question it. She just smiled. "Well, aren't you two handsome little guys? What can I get y'all?" Noah shifted, unsure. Elias stayed quiet. Ben took the menu and slid it toward them. "How about pancakes?" Noah hesitated before nodding. Elias followed, but his grip on the table tightened. Martha's smile softened. "You boys ever had chocolate chip pancakes before?" Both of them shook their heads. Martha's expression flickered with something Ben recognized, sadness. The same kind of sadness he had felt when they told him they had never had pancakes before. "Well," she said, her voice gentle, "you're in for a treat." As she walked away, Ben glanced at the boys. Elias was staring at his hands. Noah was watching the other customers with cautious eyes, as if trying to memorize every exit, every possible escape route. Ben sighed. "You guys okay?" Noah nodded automatically. Elias stayed silent. Ben ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I get it. This is weird. You don't know me. I don't know you. But," he hesitated. "You don't have to be scared. No one's gonna hurt you here." Elias's hands curled into fists. Ben noticed. Before he could say anything else, Martha returned with their plates. The pancakes were golden brown, topped with melting chocolate chips and a swirl of whipped cream. She set them down gently, along with small bottles of syrup. Elias and Noah stared. Noah was the first to move. He picked up his fork carefully, almost reverently, as if he didn't quite believe this was real. Elias hesitated. Ben watched as Noah took a bite. The second the pancake hit his tongue, his eyes widened. Ben smirked. "Good?" Noah nodded, swallowing quickly. Then, almost shyly, he murmured, "It's really good." Elias finally picked up his fork. His first bite was small, hesitant. Then, his expression changed. For the first time since Ben had met them, something flickered in his eyes, something fragile, something almost like joy. Ben felt his chest tighten. He hadn't done much. Just pancakes. But to them? Maybe it was everything. The first crack. Halfway through breakfast, Noah finally spoke again. "Are you gonna send us back?" The question came out of nowhere. Ben blinked. "What?" Noah stared at his plate. "The other ones always gave us back." Elias flinched. Ben exhaled. He hadn't been ready for this conversation. "I don't know what's gonna happen," he admitted. "I didn't plan this. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't think I can just walk away." Noah looked up at him. "You mean it?" Ben nodded. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, Elias whispered, "Okay." Ben's throat tightened. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing. He didn't know if he was capable of this. But as he watched them take another bite of their pancakes, saw the way they slowly, hesitantly, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone wouldn't leave this time. He knew one thing. He wasn't walking away. Not this time. Shadows of the past. Ben didn't sleep much that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment from the day. The boys had barely spoken on the way back from the diner. After finishing their pancakes, Noah had loosened up just a little, even smiling once when Ben let him steal extra whipped cream from his plate. But Elias had remained quiet, his expression unreadable. It was like the kid had built walls so high, not even daylight could reach him. Ben sighed, rubbing his face. "What the hell are you doing, Ben?" He wasn't a father. Hell, he wasn't even sure he was a good man anymore. But when he looked at those boys, saw the way they flinched at sudden movements, the way they never let their backs face a door, the way their hands still trembled when they thought no one was watching, he knew one thing. He wasn't about to throw them back into whatever hell they had come from. Not now. Not ever. A home, not a house. The next morning, Ben woke up to the sound of hushed voices. He sat up, groggy, and listened. Elias and Noah. The boys were whispering in the hallway. Ben swung his legs over the bed, pulling on a shirt before stepping out of his room. He found them standing near the bathroom, their backs pressed against the wall as if they were afraid to take up space. Noah was holding onto Elias's sleeve. Elias looked tense. Too tense. Ben frowned. Everything okay? Noah flinched at the sound of his voice, his fingers tightening on Elias's shirt. Elias didn't answer right away. Then, after a long pause, he murmured, "Where do you want us to sleep?" Ben blinked. "That's what this is about?" he asked, rubbing the back of his neck. "I already told you, you can have the spare room." Elias's jaw clenched. Noah shifted nervously. "We don't want to take up too much space," he mumbled. Ben sighed. He crouched down so they were eye level. "Listen, this is your home now. You don't have to ask permission to exist." Noah glanced at Elias, as if looking for confirmation. Elias just stared at Ben, his blue-gray eyes guarded. "People always say that," he said quietly. "Until they don't mean it anymore." Ben felt something in his chest tighten. How many times had these kids been promised safety, only to be thrown away like trash? He swallowed. "I mean it," he said firmly. "And I don't break my word." For a moment, Elias didn't move. Then, finally, he nodded. It wasn't much. But it was a start. Cracks in the armor. Over the next few days, things slowly settled into a fragile routine. Ben took time off from work, spending most of his days figuring out how to take care of two traumatized kids who didn't trust him. Noah was easier. He was still wary, but curiosity had begun to outweigh his fear. He followed Ben around the house, watching everything with wide eyes. How Ben made coffee, how he folded laundry, how he put his gun in a locked safe every night. Elias, on the other hand, kept his distance. He spoke in short, clipped sentences. Never asked for anything. And every night, Ben would wake up to find him sitting in the hallway outside Noah's room, his back against the wall, eyes wide open. Like he was standing guard. Ben never commented on it. He just left an extra blanket out, hoping Elias would take it. The bruises beneath the skin. It wasn't until the fourth night that everything cracked open. Ben had been in the kitchen, washing dishes, when he heard it. A muffled whimper. At first, he thought he imagined it. But then he heard it again. Ben grabbed a towel and moved quickly down the hall, his heart pounding. It was coming from the spare room. Noah's room. Ben pushed the door open, then froze. Noah was curled in a ball under the covers, his body trembling, his tiny hands fisting the blanket. His face was twisted in fear, soft gasps escaping his lips. A nightmare. Ben had seen this before, back when he was a rookie cop, responding to domestic calls where children had seen things they never should have. He crouched down beside the bed, keeping his voice gentle. "Noah, hey, kiddo, wake up." Noah jolted awake with a gasp, his eyes wild and unfocused. Ben reached out instinctively, only for Noah to jerk back so fast he nearly fell off the bed. Ben's stomach dropped. He raised both hands, keeping his voice calm. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe." Noah blinked rapidly, his breathing ragged. Then, before Ben could say anything else, Elias appeared in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his hands were clenched into fists. Without a word, he moved to Noah's side, gripping his brother's shoulder. Noah latched onto him instantly. Ben exhaled slowly. Elias looked up at him. For the first time since they had met, there was something other than guarded suspicion in his eyes. Something raw. Something desperate. Ben hesitated, then made a decision. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked softly. Elias didn't answer right away. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. Ben pulled the chair from the desk, settling into it. He didn't speak. Didn't ask questions. He just sat there, keeping watch. And as the hours passed, as Noah's breathing evened out, as Elias's posture finally relaxed just the tiniest bit, Ben realized something. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. And neither did they, buried wounds and dark truths. Ben barely slept that night. He stayed in the chair, watching as Noah drifted back into a restless sleep, his small fingers still curled around Elias's sleeve. Elias didn't sleep at all. He stayed awake, his back against the headboard, his eyes never leaving Noah's face. Ben didn't push him. He wanted to. He wanted to tell Elias that no kid should have to carry this kind of weight. But trust was a fragile thing. And Elias was still holding his heart behind an iron gate. So Ben did the only thing he could, he stayed. Even when his body ached from exhaustion, even when the house fell into deep silence, even when dawn crept through the curtains. He stayed. Morning tension. The next morning, Ben made breakfast. It wasn't much: scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon. Noah stared at his plate like it was some kind of foreign delicacy. "We don't usually eat breakfast," he said, voice small. Ben frowned. "Not even at the orphanage?" Noah shook his head. "There wasn't enough food. We only got leftovers." Something cold slithered through Ben's veins. He glanced at Elias, who was gripping his fork too tightly. "Is that where you were before I found you?" Ben asked carefully. Elias's jaw tightened. Noah, unaware of his brother's growing tension, nodded. "Yeah. It was our third place. No one ever picked us." Ben felt something clench inside his chest. Third place? How many times had these kids been passed around, shuffled from one miserable situation to another? Noah took a cautious bite of bacon, his eyes lighting up a little. "This is really good." Ben ruffled his hair. "Eat up, kiddo. There's plenty." Elias still hadn't touched his food. Ben didn't push him. But when Elias thought he wasn't looking, Ben saw him tear off a piece of toast and tuck it into his pocket. For later. For survival. Ben felt sick. Unanswered questions. Later that day, Ben sat in his truck outside the grocery store, watching as the boys sat in the back seat. He needed answers. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Detective Briggs," a gruff voice answered. Ben took a deep breath. "Briggs, it's me." A pause. Then, "Carter? Thought you were taking time off." "I am," Ben said. "Listen, I need a favor." Briggs snorted. "Of course you do. What is it?" Ben glanced in the rearview mirror at the boys. Noah was humming quietly to himself, running his fingers over the window. Elias, however, was stiff. Watching. Always watching. "I need information on two kids," Ben said. Noah and Elias Reed. They were in the system. There was silence on the other end. Then Briggs exhaled. "You sure you want to dig into this?" Ben frowned. "What does that mean?" Briggs hesitated. "Hold on." There was the sound of typing in the background. Ben drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, anxiety creeping in. Then Briggs cursed under his breath. Ben sat up. "What?" Another pause. "Carter," Briggs said, his tone different now. Low. Serious. "Those kids, they didn't just get moved around. They vanished from the system 2 years ago." Ben's blood ran cold. "What?" Briggs continued typing. "I don't know how they ended up back in an orphanage, but according to these records, they were listed as missing. Their last foster home burned down. No bodies were found." Ben gripped the steering wheel. "And before that?" A long silence. Then Briggs muttered, "Jesus Christ." Ben's pulse pounded. "What?" Briggs sighed. Their biological parents were arrested for child neglect and abuse. They had ties to some really bad people. Human trafficking, illegal dealings. You name it. Ben's stomach twisted. What happened to them? The father died in a prison fight. The mother, she disappeared before sentencing. No one knows where she is. Ben's grip tightened. No wonder Elias doesn't trust anyone. No wonder Noah flinches in his sleep. They weren't just abandoned. They were hunted. The truth comes out. Ben ended the call and took a deep breath. His hands were shaking. He turned around in his seat, looking at the boys. Noah, he said carefully, where were you before the orphanage? Noah blinked. He glanced at Elias. Elias shook his head, subtle, almost invisible. But Noah was still a child. And children wanted to be heard. He hesitated, then whispered, a basement. Ben's heart stopped. Elias shot his brother a warning look, but it was too late. Ben's voice was hoarse. What kind of basement? Noah fidgeted. It was small. Dark. Sometimes people came, but we never talked to them. We had to be quiet. Ben forced himself to stay calm. Did someone take you? Elias's fists clenched. Noah nodded. Yeah. Ben felt rage boiling beneath his skin. Elias finally spoke. It doesn't matter. We got away. Ben met his gaze. How? Elias stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then he said, I made sure we did. Ben didn't miss the meaning behind those words. He didn't ask for details. Not yet. Instead, he swallowed down his anger, his fear, his overwhelming need to protect these kids, and said, you don't have to run anymore. Elias's lips pressed into a thin line. Noah, however, just looked hopeful. Ben started the engine. We're going home. The storm ahead. That night, Ben sat on the couch with his old police files spread across the table. He needed to find out who had been after those boys. Who had failed them? Who was still out there? Because one thing was certain, if their mother had disappeared, there was a chance she was still looking for them. And Ben would be damned if he let anyone take them away again. Not on his watch. Not ever. Shadows of the past. The house was too quiet. Ben sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old police files spread out before him. The dim overhead light flickered slightly, casting uneasy shadows on the walls. He rubbed his temple, exhaustion weighing on him. He had spent the last few hours combing through every available record of Elias and Noah Reed. Court cases, foster reports, missing person alerts. It all painted a grim picture. Their parents had been deeply involved in criminal activity, human trafficking, underground deals, violence. Their father had died in prison, but their mother, she had disappeared. Vanished without a trace. And that terrified Ben more than anything. Because people like that didn't just disappear. They hid. And they always came back for what they lost. A soft rustling noise pulled Ben from his thoughts. He turned. Elias stood in the hallway, barely visible in the low light. His silhouette was tense, shoulders squared, face unreadable. Ben leaned back in his chair. Can't sleep? Elias didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stepped into the kitchen. Where did you get those? His voice was quiet but sharp. His eyes flickered to the documents. Ben exhaled, setting his pen down. I made a few calls. Elias's gaze darkened. You're digging into our past. Ben studied him carefully. I needed to know the truth. Elias scoffed, shaking his head. The truth? The truth is that none of this matters. The past doesn't matter. Ben held his gaze. You don't believe that. Elias clenched his fists, his breathing controlled but heavy. I need it to not matter. Ben didn't push. Instead, he reached for one of the reports and turned it toward Elias. I found something. Elias hesitated before stepping closer. His eyes flicked over the paper, scanning the details. Then he froze. Ben pointed at a single line. Mother, Margaret Reed. Status, unknown. Last seen, 2 months ago in Arizona. Elias's fingers curled around the edge of the table. His jaw tightened. She's looking for us, he murmured. Ben's chest ached. I think so. Elias's breath hitched, just for a second. Then he straightened, face hardening. Then we need to leave. No, Ben's voice was firm. Elias's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. You don't understand. Ben leaned forward. Then make me understand. For a long moment, Elias just stood there, his shoulders shaking with the effort to hold everything in. Then, slowly, he sat down across from Ben. I killed a man, Elias whispered. The words sent a chill through Ben's spine. His mind raced. He had expected something dark, but this? Elias stared at the table, refusing to meet Ben's eyes. It was in the basement. A man came in. He was going to take Noah. I couldn't let him. His voice wavered, but he pushed on. I found something sharp. A piece of broken metal. I stabbed him. Ben's stomach twisted, but he kept his voice steady. And then? Elias swallowed. I grabbed Noah and we ran. Silence stretched between them. Ben felt like his lungs weren't working right. He wanted to say something, anything, but words failed him. This kid, this 15-year-old, had been forced to fight for his life. To fight for his brother's life. And yet, sitting in front of Ben now, he wasn't seeking sympathy. He was preparing to run again. I'll turn myself in if I have to, Elias said suddenly. I won't let Noah get dragged back into this. Ben's heart clenched. He reached across the table, placing a firm hand over Elias's. You're not turning yourself in. Elias flinched slightly at the touch, but he didn't pull away. Ben's grip tightened. You were protecting Noah. That's not murder. That's survival. Elias's breath was shaky. You don't get it. If she finds us, she won't care about that. She'll take us back. Ben's expression hardened. She won't get near you. I won't let her. Elias finally looked at him. You can't promise that. Ben leaned forward, his voice like steel. Yes. I can. A long silence stretched between them. Then. A loud bang on the front door. Ben's body went rigid. Elias's breath hitched. He scrambled up, grabbing the nearest knife from the kitchen counter. Ben stood, motioning for Elias to stay put. Go to Noah. Stay with him. Elias hesitated, but after a moment, he nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Ben took a deep breath, steadying himself before moving toward the door. His fingers hovered over his gun as he peered through the peephole. A figure stood outside. A woman. She was tall, thin, her long dark hair hanging in unkempt waves around her pale face. Her lips were curled into a smirk, as if she already knew she had one. Margaret Reed. Ben's stomach turned to ice. She tilted her head, as if sensing him behind the door. Then she spoke, her voice muffled but eerily calm. You have something that belongs to me. Ben's grip on his gun tightened. His pulse pounded in his ears. He would keep his promise. Even if it meant facing the devil herself.